The rain arrives before dawn over the Campanian plain, soft at first, then steady, drumming against 2,000 windows and running down facades the color of honey turned gray in the half-light. Inside the palace of Caserta, silence holds in corridors wider than most village streets. The air smells of old stone and wax and something deeper, something like patience worn thin. Somewhere far below, in chambers most visitors will never see, a pump begins its morning cycle, pushing water through pipes laid 2 centuries ago, through arteries hidden beneath marble floors where kings once walked and tourists now shuffle in guided rows. The beauty here is undeniable, overwhelming even. But beauty of this magnitude requires more than admiration to survive. It requires maintenance, money, constant attention, and the kind of labor that leaves no signature, no monument of its own. The Palace of Caserta is not simply a building. It is a system, vast and fragile, kept alive not by the glory of its past, but by decisions made every single day about what can be saved and what must be surrendered. To stand before this palace is to feel small. That sensation is not accidental. Every dimension was calculated to produce exactly that response. The facade stretches 247 meters across, 5 stories tall, a wall of stone and window that refuses to be taken in all at once. 1,200 rooms fill the interior, arranged around 4 identical courtyards, each large enough to hold a cathedral. The grand staircase rises in a single majestic sweep of marble, 116 steps, flanked by lions carved from single blocks of stone, hauled from quarries 50 kilometers away. The throne room alone could swallow most manor houses whole. Ceilings soar 10 meters overhead, frescoed with gods and battles and allegorical triumphs, all rendered in colors that still catch light despite 2.5 centuries of candle smoke, coal dust, and the slow erosion of time. To walk these halls is to move through a landscape designed to communicate power without words, to make any visitor understand, immediately and viscerally, that they stand inside the dream of someone who commanded the resources of a kingdom and the will to transform stone and sweat into permanence. But dreams at this scale do not rise from desire alone. They require materials, transport, organization, and above all, human effort measured not in weeks or months, but in decades. The Palace of Caserta was conceived in 1752 by Charles VII of Naples, later Charles III of Spain, a Bourbon monarch who inherited a kingdom wealthy from trade and agriculture, but lacking a symbol grand enough to rival Versailles or the palaces of Vienna. Charles wanted more than a residence. He wanted a statement, a seat of government, a military academy, a center of culture and administration, all enclosed within a single structure that would announce to Europe and to his own subjects that the Kingdom of Naples was a power to be reckoned with. He turned to Luigi Vanvitelli, an architect trained in Rome, a man who understood the language of grandeur, but also possessed the engineering mind necessary to make such ambitions real. Vanvitelli was 52 when he received the commission, at the height of his powers, but aware that what the king proposed would consume the rest of his life. He spent months surveying the site, a broad plain north of Naples where the Bourbon family already owned vast estates. The land was fertile, the water supply reliable thanks to the nearby mountains, and the location strategic, far enough from the coast to be defensible, yet close enough to the capital to remain relevant. Vanvitelli drew plans that borrowed from the great palaces of Europe, but exceeded them in scale. His design called for interconnected courtyards, vast gardens stretching into the distance, waterworks fed by aqueducts, and a structure so large that it would contain not just royal apartments, but administrative offices, servants' quarters, workshops, stables, a chapel, a theater, and everything necessary for a self-contained world. The palace would not depend on the city. It would be the city. Construction began in January of 1753 with a foundation ceremony attended by the king himself, who laid the first stone with full ceremonial ritual. What followed was not magic, but mathematics, logistics, and unrelenting physical effort. Tens of thousands of workers moved through the site over the next 3 decades. Stonemasons, bricklayers, carpenters, blacksmiths, plasterers, painters, gilders, glaziers, hydraulic engineers, gardeners, road builders, carters, laborers whose sole job was to haul materials from one place to another. Limestone came from quarries in the hills, each block cut by hand, shaped, numbered, loaded onto carts, and dragged by oxen along roads built specifically for this purpose. Marble arrived from Carrara and Sicily, timber from the forests of Calabria, iron from forges across the kingdom. The organization required to keep this operation running was staggering. Schedules had to be maintained, materials stockpiled, payments made, disputes resolved, injuries treated, food and shelter provided for workers who lived on site for years at a time. The sheer volume of material gives a sense of the undertaking. More than 2 million cubic meters of stone and brick were used in the construction. The roof alone required over 1 million terracotta tiles. The flooring consumed thousands of square meters of marble, porphyry, and decorative inlay. The windows numbered in the thousands, each pane of glass hand-blown and set into frames carved from wood that had to be treated, sealed, and fitted with precision. Iron grills, bronze fittings, gilded ornamentation, chandeliers, mirrors, door handles, hinges, locks, keys. Every element multiplied across 1,200 rooms became a monumental task in itself. And beneath all of this visible splendor, invisible networks spread through the structure. Drainage systems to carry away rainwater and waste, ventilation shafts to allow air circulation, storage vaults for food, wine, coal, candles, linens, tools, and all the supplies necessary to keep a palace functioning. A heating system that relied on fireplaces in nearly every significant room, each requiring daily attention, fuel delivery, and chimney maintenance. Water was perhaps the most ambitious element of Vanvitelli's vision. He designed an aqueduct to bring water from the springs of Monte Taburno, 40 kilometers away, across valleys and hills, through tunnels blasted from rock, over bridges built to Roman specifications. The Aqueducto Carolino, as it came to be known, was an engineering marvel in its own right, stretching over 38 kilometers and culminating in a series of arches that stood over 50 meters tall. The water it carried fed the palace fountains, the gardens, the royal apartments, the kitchens, and the elaborate cascade that became one of Caserta's most celebrated features. But building the aqueduct required its own army of workers, its own supply chain, its own years of dangerous labor in remote mountains where men drilled through solid stone with hand tools and black powder. Vanvitelli himself did not live to see the palace completed. He died in 1773, 20 years after construction began, leaving his son Carlo to continue the work. The king who commissioned it, Charles, had already departed for Spain in 1759, called to assume the Spanish throne and leaving Naples to his young son Ferdinand. The vision that began with one man's ambition passed through generations, shaped by new hands, adjusted to new realities, but never abandoned. By the time the palace reached something resembling completion in the late 1780s, it had consumed more than 45 million ducats, a sum almost impossible to translate into modern terms, but representing a significant portion of the kingdom's annual revenue over several decades. The cost was not merely financial. It was measured in lives altered, in workers who spent their prime years hauling stone, in families who depended on palace wages, in craftsmen who poured their skill into details that would outlast their names. Who paid for all of this? The answer is both simple and complex. The royal treasury funded construction, but royal treasuries are filled by taxes, rents, tariffs, and the labor of subjects who rarely saw the inside of such palaces. The farmers of Campania, the merchants of Naples, the fishermen of the coast, the shepherds of the hills, all contributed through the taxes they paid on grain, wine, livestock, and trade. The system was feudal in essence, extracting wealth from the land and those who worked it, concentrating that wealth in the hands of the monarchy, and then directing it toward projects that served the crown's political and symbolic purposes. The palace was built on the backs of people who would never walk its grand staircase, never dine in its halls, never see their own faces reflected in its gilded mirrors. This is not unique to Caserta. It is the fundamental mechanism by which monumental architecture has always been produced. But understanding this does not diminish the achievement. It complicates it, adds weight to the beauty, makes the marble feel heavier. Once built, the palace required a different kind of labor to sustain it. A permanent staff of hundreds, eventually growing to over 1,000 during peak periods, kept the structure functioning. Footmen, valets, chambermaids, cooks, scullions, laundresses, lamplighters, grooms, gardeners, porters, pages, musicians, chaplains, tutors, secretaries, accountants, and an entire hierarchy of stewards and majordomo who managed the others. Each morning, fires had to be lit in dozens of rooms. Each night, candles had to be replaced, wicks trimmed, wax drippings cleaned. Meals required constant preparation, not just for the royal family, but for the court, guests, and the staff themselves. Linens had to be washed, dried, ironed, and stored. Floors had to be swept and polished, windows cleaned, furniture dusted, silver polished, paintings inspected for damage, tapestries beaten to remove dust, gardens weeded and pruned and watered. The palace was a living organism, and like all organisms, it required constant feeding and care to prevent decay. The gardens alone demanded a staggering level of maintenance. Stretching over 3 kilometers from the palace to the cascade, they featured long reflecting pools, sculptural fountains, geometric parterres, orchards, wooded groves, and the famous English garden added in the 1780s, complete with artificial ruins and exotic plantings. Keeping the fountains running meant maintaining the aqueduct, clearing pipes, repairing leaks, managing water pressure. Keeping the lawns green required mowing by hand with scythes, watering in dry months, replanting damaged sections. Keeping the sculptures intact meant regular cleaning, patching cracks, replacing pieces damaged by weather or vandalism. The scale was such that gardeners worked year-round, divided into specialized teams, each responsible for specific sections or tasks. The cost of this labor, year after year, became a permanent drain on royal finances, one that could not be reduced without visible consequences. Ferdinand IV, who inherited the throne as a child and ruled for decades with varying degrees of competence, lived in the palace for much of his life, but never fully embraced the administrative vision his grandfather Charles had imagined. Ferdinand preferred hunting, feasting, and the company of commoners to the rigid ceremonial life the palace demanded. Yet the palace continued to function because the system that sustained it had momentum, because stopping would have meant admitting failure, and because the symbolic value of Caserta remained important even when the practical uses diminished. The palace hosted ambassadors, military officers, scholars, artists, and countless visitors who came to marvel at the scale and luxury. It served as a stage for royal weddings, baptisms, state banquets, and the intricate theater of court politics. Every event required preparation, coordination, expense. Every guest required housing, feeding, entertaining. The palace consumed resources the way a fire consumes wood, constantly without pause. Then came revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 sent shock waves across Europe, and Naples, allied with Austria and hostile to revolutionary France, found itself drawn into the wars that followed. In 1799, French forces invaded southern Italy, and Ferdinand fled to Sicily under British protection. A short-lived Neapolitan republic was declared, and the Palace of Caserta became a symbol of the old regime, looted by revolutionaries and occupying troops, stripped of valuables, its administrative functions suspended. The damage was not catastrophic, but the interruption revealed how fragile the system was. Without the royal household in residence, without the flow of money to pay staff and maintain operations, the palace began to deteriorate. Roofs leaked, gardens overgrew, rooms stood empty and cold. When Ferdinand returned later that year, backed by loyalist forces and brutal reprisals against republicans, he found his palace diminished, scarred by occupation, a reminder that even structures built to project permanence could be vulnerable. The Napoleonic Wars brought further instability. In 1806, Napoleon installed his brother Joseph as King of Naples, and 2 years later replaced him with his brother-in-law Joachim Murat. Both men used the Palace of Caserta, appreciated its grandeur, and even invested in some improvements, including completing portions of the interior decoration left unfinished. But their rule was brief and contested, and when the Bourbon monarchy was restored in 1815 after Napoleon's defeat, the palace returned to Ferdinand, now calling himself Ferdinand III of the Two Sicilies, ruling over a unified kingdom that included both Naples and Sicily. The restoration brought stability, but not prosperity. The wars had drained the treasury, weakened the economy, and left the kingdom dependent on Austria and other conservative powers to maintain order. The 19th century posed new challenges. The palace, designed for absolute monarchy and court society, began to seem out of step with a changing world. Liberal revolutions in 1820 and 1848 challenged royal authority, demanding constitutions, parliaments, and limits on monarchical power. Though these uprisings were suppressed, they signaled a shift in political culture. The palace, with its vast empty rooms and extravagant maintenance costs, became a target of criticism. Why should public funds support such luxury when infrastructure crumbled, schools lacked resources, and the peasantry lived in poverty? The question was not new, but it grew harder to dismiss. The monarchy responded by opening portions of the palace to limited public access, framing it not as a private indulgence, but as a national treasure, a source of pride for all subjects. This was a calculated shift, an early form of public relations, but it also marked the beginning of a transformation. The palace was no longer solely a royal residence. It was becoming a monument, a museum, a symbol divorced from its original function. Italian unification in 1861 ended the independent kingdom of the Two Sicilies and incorporated southern Italy into the new Italian state. The Bourbon monarchy was deposed, the royal family exiled, and the Palace of Caserta became property of the Italian government. This transition could have led to abandonment or destruction, as happened to many symbols of deposed regimes, but Caserta was spared. The new government recognized its value, both cultural and political. The palace could serve as a military academy, administrative center, and eventually a public museum. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, portions of the palace were adapted for these purposes. Soldiers drilled in the courtyards, officers occupied apartments once reserved for nobles, classrooms filled rooms where courtiers once schemed. The gardens, though less meticulously maintained than in royal times, remained open and became a popular destination for locals and travelers. But the cost of maintaining the structure never disappeared. It merely shifted from the monarchy to the state, from royal revenue to public budgets. And public budgets are always contested, subject to competing priorities, political pressures, and economic cycles. The Italian government struggled to fund adequate maintenance, especially as the palace aged and systems installed in the 18th century began to fail. Roofs deteriorated, plaster cracked and fell, wooden floors warped, pipes corroded, fountains ceased to flow. The gardens, once immaculate, grew wild in sections, statues weathered and lost details. The aqueduct suffered from neglect and began to leak. Each repair required funds, expertise, and political will. Each delay meant further damage, higher eventual costs, and loss of irreplaceable details. The two world wars brought new forms of damage. During the First World War, portions of the palace served as a hospital for wounded soldiers, with makeshift wards installed in the grandest rooms, blood and antiseptic replacing perfume and wax. The structure survived intact, but the wear was significant. The Second World War was more destructive. Allied forces used Caserta as a headquarters after liberating southern Italy in 1943. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight Eisenhower, worked from rooms within the palace, planning operations, coordinating logistics, hosting meetings that shaped the course of the war. The palace's scale and infrastructure made it ideal for such purposes, but military occupation meant conversion, alteration, and neglect of preservation. Troops were housed in rooms never intended for such use. Equipment was installed without regard for historical fabric, and the strain on systems was immense. The German surrender in Italy was signed at Caserta in April 1945, a moment of historical significance that tied the palace forever to the war's conclusion. But when the soldiers left, they left behind a structure battered by years of hard use, in desperate need of restoration. Post-war Italy faced poverty, political instability, and the enormous task of rebuilding cities, infrastructure, and economy. Funding for cultural heritage was limited, and the Palace of Caserta, vast and expensive, was not a priority. For decades, it languished in a state of managed decline. Tourism grew slowly, hampered by poor transportation, lack of promotion, and the palace's location in a region often overlooked by visitors focused on Rome, Florence, and Venice. Those who did visit encountered grandeur mixed with decay, magnificent rooms adjacent to closed wings, gardens beautiful in parts but neglected in others. Guides, often underpaid and understaffed, did their best to convey the history, but the overall impression was of a monument struggling to survive, a place whose past glory only highlighted present difficulties. The turning point came gradually, beginning in the 1970s and accelerating in the 1990s. Italy began to recognize cultural heritage not just as a point of national pride, but as an economic asset, a driver of tourism and regional development. The Palace of Caserta, along with its aqueduct in the nearby model town of San Lucio, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997, a recognition that brought international attention and, crucially, access to funding and technical support. Restoration projects were initiated, focusing first on the most urgent structural issues, roofs, facades, drainage, and then expanding to interior decoration, gardens, and visitor infrastructure. These projects were expensive, often costing millions of euros per phase, and required collaboration between government agencies, private donors, and European Union cultural programs. The work was slow, painstaking, requiring specialists in historical materials and techniques, artisans trained in traditional crafts, engineers able to integrate modern systems without damaging historical fabric. One major challenge was the aqueduct. By the late 20th century, large sections had fallen into disrepair, tunnels were clogged, bridges crumbling, the water flow reduced to a trickle. Without the aqueduct, the fountains could not operate, and the gardens suffered. A comprehensive restoration was undertaken over several years, involving clearing debris, repairing masonry, stabilizing structures, and even rebuilding sections that had collapsed. The cost was substantial, but the result was transformative. When the water began flowing again, the fountain sprang to life, the cascade roared, and visitors could experience the gardens as Vanvitelli had intended. The restoration also provided practical benefits, as the aqueduct could supply water for irrigation, reducing reliance on modern municipal systems. Inside the palace, conservators worked room by room, cleaning frescoes, stabilizing plaster, restoring gilding, repairing furniture, and addressing the damage caused by centuries of use, neglect, and environmental exposure. Each intervention required careful research to understand original materials and techniques, testing to ensure compatibility, and meticulous execution to preserve authenticity. This kind of work cannot be rushed. A single frescoed ceiling might take months or years to clean properly, using soft brushes, mild solvents, and magnifying instruments to remove grime without harming the paint beneath. Textiles, such as tapestries and upholstery, required even more delicate handling, often needing to be removed, treated in specialized laboratories, and reinstalled with supports to prevent further stress. The cost per square meter was high, but cutting corners would have meant losing irreplaceable artistry. Modern management of the palace balances preservation with public access, education with revenue generation, historical integrity with contemporary needs. The palace is now operated by the Italian Ministry of Culture through a dedicated administrative office that manages ticketing, tours, events, security, maintenance, and conservation. The staff includes curators, historians, conservators, guards, ticketing agents, cleaners, gardeners, technicians, and administrators, totaling several hundred people. Each role is essential to keeping the palace functioning, yet funding remains a constant struggle. Ticket revenue covers a significant portion of operating costs, but not all. Government subsidies make up the difference, but these are subject to budget cuts, political shifts, and competing demands. The palace must justify its existence annually, demonstrate its value in economic and cultural terms, and adapt to changing expectations. Tourism is both a solution and a challenge. The palace now attracts over 1 million visitors each year, generating revenue and raising awareness, but also creating wear. Footsteps erode floors, breath and body heat affect climate control, crowds strain infrastructure and staff. Managing this flow requires careful planning, timed entry, designated routes, protective barriers, and continuous monitoring. The goal is to allow access without causing damage, to share the palace's beauty without consuming it. This balance is delicate and requires constant adjustment. Too many visitors and the palace suffers. Too few and the revenue drops, threatening the budget for maintenance and conservation. Events and filming provide additional revenue. The palace has hosted concerts, fashion shows, film productions, and private events, renting out spaces for fees that support operations. But each event poses risks. Equipment can damage floors, lighting generates heat, crowds exceed safe capacities. Contracts must specify protections, insurance must be secured, staff must supervise every detail. The trade-off is explicit. Accept some risk and wear in exchange for funds needed to preserve the whole. It is a pragmatic decision, reflecting the reality that idealism alone cannot pay for roof repairs or heating systems. Technology has become an essential tool. Digital documentation, including laser scanning and photogrammetry, creates precise records of every surface, enabling better planning for conservation and providing data that can be used if damage occurs. Climate control systems, carefully integrated to avoid visible intrusion, help stabilize temperature and humidity in key rooms, reducing the stress on materials. Security systems, including cameras and alarms, protect against theft and vandalism, which remain persistent threats. Visitor management software tracks flow, identifies bottlenecks, and helps optimize staffing. These technologies are expensive to install and maintain, but they represent investments in the palace's future, tools that make long-term survival more feasible. Yet, for all the progress, the fundamental challenge remains unchanged. The Palace of Caserta is too large, too complex, and too costly to sustain without continuous, substantial financial support. There are rooms that have not been fully restored, wings that remain closed to the public, systems that still rely on outdated infrastructure. The gardens, though improved, require constant attention, and the aqueduct, though restored, will need ongoing maintenance to prevent future collapse. The staff is dedicated but stretched thin, balancing multiple demands with limited resources. Every winter brings the risk of freeze damage, every summer the threat of drought, every storm the possibility of flooding or structural strain. The palace does not rest. It demands care every day in ways both visible and invisible. The people who provide that care rarely receive recognition. The conservators who spend weeks cleaning a single painting, the gardeners who prune trees and weed paths in all weather, the technicians who repair wiring and plumbing hidden behind historic walls, the guards who stand for hours, ensuring no one touches the fragile surfaces, the cleaners who arrive before dawn to prepare rooms for visitors. These are the ones who keep the palace alive. Their labor is essential, skilled, and often undervalued. They are paid modest wages, work long hours, and receive little public acknowledgement. Yet without them, the palace would fall silent, the beauty would fade, the systems would fail. They are the latest generation in an unbroken chain, stretching back to those first workers who hauled stone across the Campanian plain, part of a system that has never stopped demanding human effort. Understanding who paid for the palace requires looking beyond the initial construction to the centuries that followed. The answer is layered. The farmers and merchants of the Kingdom of Naples paid through taxes that funded Bourbon ambitions. The workers paid with their labor, their health, sometimes their lives. The Italian state paid with public funds diverted from other uses. Today's visitors pay with ticket fees, funding a portion of operations. The European Union and private donors pay through grants and contributions, and the staff pays with their daily work, their expertise, their commitment to something larger than themselves. The cost is distributed across time and across society, borne by people who may never fully comprehend the magnitude of what they sustain. What does it cost to keep the palace alive today? The operating budget fluctuates, but recent years have seen annual costs in the range of 10 to 15 million euros, covering salaries, utilities, routine maintenance, security, conservation, administration, and public programming. Major restoration projects add millions more, often funded separately through special allocations or partnerships. Heating alone in winter consumes vast amounts of energy, a reminder that the palace was designed for a different era when fuel was cheap and climate change was not yet a consideration. Cooling in summer, though less extensive, still strains resources. Lighting, water, waste management, insurance, regulatory compliance, each represents a line item in a budget that never quite stretches far enough. Difficult choices must be made constantly. Which rooms to restore first? Which systems to upgrade? Where to cut when funds fall short? These decisions shape what the palace becomes, what survives, and what is lost. The philosophical dimension of these choices is profound. To maintain the Palace of Caserta is to engage in an act of collective memory, to insist that the past remains relevant, that beauty and craftsmanship and human ambition deserve preservation even when they carry uncomfortable histories. The palace was built by an unjust system, funded by extraction, sustained by hierarchy. Acknowledging this does not negate the achievement, but deepens it, forces a reckoning with the complexities of heritage. We inherit not just the beauty, but the costs, not just the glory, but the compromises. To keep the palace alive is to accept responsibility for that inheritance, to commit to care despite the difficulty, to recognize that great works are never finished, only maintained or abandoned. The dream that Charles of Bourbon and Luigi Vanvitelli pursued was grand, perhaps impossibly so, a vision of order, power, and permanence rendered in stone. They achieved something remarkable, something that still inspires awe, but they could not make it eternal. Permanence is an illusion. Stone crumbles, paint fades, systems fail. What endures does so because people choose to preserve it, generation after generation, through effort that is neither glamorous nor easy. The palace survives not because it is indestructible, but because it is constantly saved over and over by decisions made in budget meetings and conservation studios, by hands wielding brushes and tools, by policies that value heritage enough to fund its care. Standing in the grand courtyard now, as afternoon light slants through the arches and tourists murmur in a dozen languages, the weight of history feels tangible. Every stone was placed by someone, every room was cleaned by someone, every system was maintained by someone. The beauty is real, overwhelming, undeniable. But it is not self-sustaining. It exists because of continuous investment, continuous labor, continuous sacrifice. The palace is not a monument to the past, it is a monument to the present, to the ongoing effort required to keep memory alive, to the fragility of even the grandest human creations. Who truly paid for this dream? Everyone who contributed labor, taxes, skill, or care. Who continues to pay? Everyone who chooses to support its preservation, whether through public funding, private donation, or the work of their own hands. The cost is shared across time, across society, across generations, and the cost is never fully paid. It recurs year after year, an obligation that does not end as long as the palace stands. What it costs to keep the palace alive today is more than money, though money is essential. It costs expertise that takes years to develop, commitment that withstands bureaucracy and frustration, vision that balances respect for the past with the needs of the present. It costs the willingness to make difficult trade-offs, to accept that not everything can be saved, that priorities must be set, that perfection is unattainable. It costs humility, the recognition that we are stewards, not owners, caretakers of something that will outlast us if we do our work well. The palace of Caserta endures not because it is loved, though many do love it, but because it is served. Service is less romantic than admiration, but far more essential. The guards who walk the halls, the gardeners who tend the paths, the conservators who clean the frescoes, the administrators who negotiate budgets, the scholars who research its history, they serve the palace, and in doing so, they serve the broader project of preserving human achievement, of maintaining continuity between past and future. Their work is a quiet heroism, easily overlooked, rarely celebrated, but absolutely necessary. Great beauty does not survive on admiration alone. It survives through continuous effort, through compromise, through the daily unglamorous work of maintenance and care. The Palace of Caserta teaches this lesson with particular clarity because of its scale, its complexity, its relentless demands. To walk its corridors is to walk through centuries of human labor, to touch surfaces shaped by countless hands, to breathe air that has witnessed triumph in crisis and adaptation. The palace is a mirror, reflecting not just the ambitions of those who built it, but the choices of those who sustain it. It asks a question of everyone who enters. What are you willing to preserve, and what will you give to keep it alive? The answer in the end is both practical and profound. We preserve what we choose to value, and we keep it alive through the resources we allocate, the work we perform, the sacrifices we accept. The Palace of Caserta stands today not because it had to, not because history demanded it, but because people decided it was worth the cost. That decision is made anew every year, every budget cycle, every time a conservator begins work on another frescoed ceiling or a gardener plants another row of flowers. The palace is not immortal. It is sustained precariously and beautifully by the collective will to remember, to care, and to serve something greater than ourselves. If the preservation of extraordinary beauty requires continuous sacrifice and invisible labor from each generation, what responsibility do we bear to those who will inherit these monuments and to those whose work keeps them standing?